behalf of the College of Architecture and Planning and the Center for Energy Research, Education and Service, both of whom are sponsoring our visit today, we worked with the Congressman's office in order to get the schedules arranged so that he was trying to be with us today. We're very pleased that we were able to do that. We're delighted that we have with us today Congressman Phil Sharp. As many of you know, he was a former member of the Ball State University faculty.
Mr. Zeidler began his architectural education at the Bauhaus in Germany during a very brief period between 1945 and 1948 when the masters regathered, and then left when the political climate became worse than Muncie's in February, and left, migrated to Canada in 1951, and in 1954 joined the firm which now bears his name, Eberhard Zeidler Roberts Partnership, and has since that time won over 75 national and international awards. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto. He is one of two Canadian architects who is a fellow in the American Institute of Architects, and has won the gold medal from the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. His quiet manner belies the energy and enthusiasm of his work. I'm sure you will enjoy it.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and try to bore you with what we have done. And I thought it might be interesting to talk about architecture because I find it the most confusing subject, and on the other hand also perhaps the most exciting. And what I wanted to discuss with you is really, is there a direction in where we are going, and how should we move when we design a building? And, you know, is there a value in theories of architecture? As architects, we have the problem to choose, because a painter perhaps has the marvelous ability to paint a series of paintings and at the end hang them on the wall, and has not to deal with the political reality and the spatial reality of it. And then at the end, history or other people can design or decide if it was right or wrong what he had done. As architects, when you have the job of building a building, you have many ideas, often perhaps too many, and out of those you must choose. And so perhaps the architectural process of building is very much like nature, a tremendous amount of variations and ideas that come to your mind, and out of those you have to pick the one that you can continue and that you should work on. And the question then comes, how do you decide it? Do you just close your eyes and say that one and off you go, or do you leave it up to your clients by showing him, well, here are 10 brilliant ideas, take your choice? Or is there a method in which we can, on a theoretical basis, pick what we think should be followed? And I think perhaps there is such a theory. It's very dangerous because theories also can become blinkers and not let us see the world as it is. And particularly modern architecture put blinkers on it, and let's say our time right now put blinkers on it too. And we have perhaps a fetish of the new, that what is new is better, rather than an understanding what makes it and why should it be in a certain way. If you perhaps follow architectural magazines over the last year, then perhaps you may get the idea that everything is permissible and it depends more or less on the editor of a certain journal what is or what isn't, or what is good and what isn't good. And then also you'll find that as years go by, their opinions changed, and what was the latest one year becomes totally deja vu the next year, and postmodernism is chased by deconstructivism or decomposition or whatever the new term of that will be. But I think when we in the end try to step back and look at it, we'll find that things really do not change that willfully, and that there are certain patterns behind there, and that there has been a very different and definite change in our understanding of architecture and perhaps really of our world, because architecture in a certain sense is a reflection of the world that we live in. And this period that is called the postmodern period, in my mind, is not to be confused with what we in architectural style have called postmodern. It is a very definite understanding of our world in a different way. And perhaps it started with the Industrial Revolution, that somehow change became a pattern. We managed to realize that things were underlying certain adjustments and changes, and as we understood more of it, these changes became more rapid, and we at the end felt that perhaps progress in itself was a wonderful thing, in particular in our Western way of looking at it, contrary to, let's say, Eastern philosophy. We looked at change as progress, as a linear projection of a line towards a better future, while Eastern philosophy perhaps looked at change as a cycle that repeated itself, like the seasons are in an endless turn. And perhaps both of those are the same, only the same element looked at from a different angle, and perhaps the world is a helix that when you look at it from the top, it looks like a circle, and if you look at it from the side, it is an upward moving line. And it always is our position how we understand the world and how we can judge what is happening and how it is happening. As I mentioned, the Industrial Revolution and with it developing philosophy of positivism, in which we believed in science as the all-embracing power to propel us into the future. And perhaps modern architecture as such was the last sign of visually trying to express that. And I was taught in this period in the belief that, as Miso Noroe said, that construction and function equal architecture, that there's a linear sequence to there that automatically gives you the solution. So that if you solve your structure, if you solve your function, automatically you did have architecture. And then it weren't only the architects that realized that this positivistic outlook was not quite the right way to look at it, and that it represented a one-way approach or one side of a reality. Unfortunately, in architecture, we took the flip in the other side, that we then said, well, if that isn't so, then construction function do not result in architecture, but form doesn't follow function, but form follows fiction. And therefore we can do anything we want to do, and we can then just grasp things from the past and put them back onto architecture at our desire, how we feel at the moment, rather than out of any necessity. But perhaps it is worthwhile to very briefly look at a certain development in philosophy to understand perhaps where our present position in architecture should be. And one, and it's often very amazing, I found the most profound influences I have had hasn't necessarily come from other architecture, but from being out of the line and field of architecture altogether. And I, through friends of mine who are scientists, was pointed towards a British philosopher, Karl Popper, who wrote a number of very fascinating books, but actually perhaps the most amazing thing about this person was that many of the Nobel Prize winners, when asked what they subscribed their winning the Nobel Prize to, pointed to Popper and said that he really had shown them how to think in a different way scientifically. And I found what he said was very, very true in my belief or my work in architecture. And actually, this particular friend of mine, who's a well-known scientist, said that he always felt like a scientific freak, but he didn't want to admit it, so he always explained when he had one or made a great discovery, how he made it. He tried to explain it on a scientific basis. What Popper did is he debunked the deductive reasoning in science. That is a reasoning that you believe that if you observe the totality of a thing, automatically from there, then you narrow it down into a new observation of science. What he found is that often when he made a great discovery, that it was a very intuitive thing, that he had an idea that something would work, and then he pursued that relentlessly, not by deductive reasoning, but by intuitive kind of creative thinking, the way in which, let's say, an architect at times has to think. And then later on proved from there that it had a scientific basis. And he was surprised when he talked to Selye, for example, that his whole theory on stress came to him really literally one night when he thought about it. And then later on proved that it was a major element. And he developed a theory of the process, and the idea was that if you have a problem, you don't move from there into deductive reasoning to a solution, but intuitively you go to a solution. Like as an architect, you have a design problem and you just throw out a solution, say, here it is. And I always tell my students, throw out a solution. Don't get lost in huge research where it is. But that solution, and that's the key to it, is not the solution, but it is the trial solution. And this trial solution, and I'm talking about science now, not architecture, this trial solution has to go through an error elimination process. And in that part, you rigorously have to undergo a investigation of why that works or doesn't work, and try everything you can to disprove that that isn't a solution. And out of this error elimination process, then finally comes a solution. And the solution then is the next problem. Because another thing that Popper said is really that science isn't the verification of the world, but the falsification of the world. And in fact, science can only be the falsification of the world. And what you cannot falsify isn't science. And with that, he started another trend that later on another philosopher, Gadamer, started, namely the follow of a philosophy called hermeneutics, coming from a name of investigation in which of research into old texts or indications of the meaning of old texts. And it has a certain resemblance to it, because that you can never know really what was meant in this old text, that only you can read into the old text what the other person put into that text, and that there's always this point of misinterpretation that is possible. And that really then Gadamer with his hermeneutics and Jean-François Lyotard started this separation, that there really are two parts to our being. That there is the one part that is a logic, and there's another part that is emotional. And it wasn't really until I read Lyotard, I mean, that I fully understood. I had called it always that here was what we called logic, and here was what we called emotion, and that these two things weren't one, and that you could neither approach logic or through logic emotions and resolve them. I mean, all our attempts to deal with them still haven't managed to do so, or to come to results. We can come close to it, but we ultimately can't fathom where it is. And vice versa, can we, on an emotional basis, resolve logic problems, and that we face two issues. And that's really what is happening in architecture, that modern architecture that tried through logic in a linear way, tried to come to it, failed. And neither would a architecture, let's say, like certain aspects of postmodern architecture, who tried to purely on an emotional basis reach a conclusion, would fail too. Lyotard, in his postmodern condition, called what I had called logic here the cognitive knowledge, and the emotion, the narrative knowledge, narrative from the kind of the cultural imprinting of the story, like the great code of the Bible or many of these things that have influenced our thinking. And it's only really when you go into another culture that you realize how much you live on such coding. We were talking in the car as we were driving, and I was relating a story. I was designing for Hong Kong a housing development, which I had as an image certain forms that Bernini had done, and the project was totally rejected. And later on I found out that it had a resemblance to a graveyard, and in Chinese is very superstitious towards graveyards and doesn't even want to look at them. And so obviously what we considered to be a beautiful form to them had great connotations of something rather horrendous and dreadful in it. So the problem then that I find we have to understand, and I think in our postmodern condition as architects, that we have to approach architecture from two sides, and that both sides are constantly present in our thinking, in our working, and in our testing of events. And I remember as a student, for example, when you presented a project and you couldn't explain on a logic basis why you did something, you were literally thrown out. I mean, you had to say that was a structural reason why you did something or a functional reason. And if these two couldn't be there, then obviously it could not find this feeling of beauty. And in fact, that isn't so. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that you cannot, or that you can simply throw away logic and the elements that are connected with it. There's another rather interesting part to it, that if we attempt to maybe look at the similar way that we have the logic or the cognitive knowledge on this side, and the narrative knowledge or the emotion on the other side. And if we then go back to Vitruvius, who talked about building as commodity firmness on the light, or commodity as function, and firmness as construction, and the light, let's say, as our way in which we look at architecture. And if you look at it, you will find all of a sudden that there are certain relations to these things, and that, for example, we can approach logic perhaps very strongly on or with logic, function, and construction, but yet only to a certain point, because we do certain things structurally that all of a sudden we do out of an emotional way, that certain things look wrong and we correct them to make them look right. People do feel unhappy, for example, under certain structural conditions, that even the most hardened structural engineer will at times design a bridge and add certain things to it because it just appears to him that it looks better if it is done in one way or the other way. And that we can, to a certain point, through logic, reach or understand the light. I mean, for example, if you have read anything of E.T. Hall or some of the silent language, or some of the research that has recently been done into environmental psychology, is the attempt to somehow reach this field through science and to understand why certain things work. I mean, for example, you go in a restaurant and you find that all people will sit down at the corner. You can then say, well, on a logic basis, that's an old caveman instinct that you feel better sitting against the wall because nobody can knock you over the head from behind. But people always will occupy the edges. So if you design a public plaza and you put the activity in the center, you'll be surprised why it won't work. But if you put the cafe around the edges, it will work. Little things like, for example, if you put in a reception area the visitor's chair less than 8 feet from the desk, you'll find the secretary can't work. You put it more than 8 feet away and he stops talking to her. And that is, let's say, how far we can reach on a logic basis certain things, but then there's a tremendous other event that is coming through imprint and we haven't found, and in my mind probably will not find the way, or at least for a time that as long as we will be there, may not reach it. An understanding why we react to certain things in a certain way and why we feel satisfied in one environment and not in another environment. And yet, so that we always have to go as far as we can to, on a scientific basis, to test what we're doing, but then also have to understand that that will only bring us to one half, and that the other half then has to be resolved on another basis, and that they are constantly interrelated with each other, and that the most hardcore scientist, in a certain sense, is as much as an artist as you think you may be as an architect or a painter, maybe for that element. And so if you approach architecture, I find you have to approach it from this very holistic feeling that all things matter in it. You can't just look at architecture as an artistic enterprise in which you have to solve certain geometric proportions and then you can walk away from it. And I find particularly if I was invited for criticisms to schools, there were certain times, when you represented cardboard events and said, well, that is our design, and you had a great speech about how the social and emotional event on this space were resolved. And when you said what the facade looked like, they looked at you as if you were a Neanderthaler that had just came out of the Dark Ages, because the idea was as long as you resolved social issues, then automatically architecture was born. And then now you go to certain schools and you are shown fantastic facades and you say how people will, or how will people use it, and again you're looked at as if you are a few years behind your time, because obviously if there's a beautiful facade, it must be beautiful architecture, and therefore people must use it. It's not quite as simple, and I think there are many points from which architecture has to be approved or approached, and in my mind resolved. And I felt I wanted to discuss maybe this resolution of architecture from 4 different points. And the first point, really, and I think perhaps the most important one, is what I would like to call the spirit of the place. And that is that architecture is not a mobile art. I mean, it's not like unfortunately, there are certain companies who feel it is, but you can't just put it anywhere. Architecture is very much rooted in the place in which, where you build it. And you have to always look at it. And if you build in Peterborough or in Toronto, or for that reason, if you have to build it here in Indianapolis, you have certain conditions that are part of the particular place where you build it. I think architects of the past seem to have a great feeling for that, but in our time we felt that technology interchanges things and we can throw something any place, but that isn't so and never will be in my mind. The other, and perhaps maybe I should really put that on top. The other element that, to my mind, is very important are human needs. And often, if I look at architecture, I wonder if particular people who have been involved have really ever thought about what were the needs of the people that use the space. And unless you understand architecture really as a second skin of humanity, as a shelter for human activities, I don't think you can design architecture. And then there is a third element, and that I would call the technology. And that has been there when people built mud houses, and has been there when they started to do frame buildings, and that is today when we have all kinds of new materials that we have to explore. Because each material demands certain ways in which it is being used, and out of that then comes a certain architectural form. And the last one I would like to call is sublime uselessness. And this sublime uselessness is also a very, very important element of architecture. Perhaps art is sublimely useless, useless in a practical sense, tremendously useful in a human sense. Yet it's very difficult to put that sublime uselessness into any other category. It does not come out of technology, it does not come out of the practical human needs. And yet it is something that is extremely important to be understood and to be incorporated into architecture. And perhaps words are only partially capable of expressing the emotional quality that architecture, that an urban space, great urban space, I mean, if you stand in some of these things, and they could be very humble spaces or very grandiose spaces, and that feeling of satisfaction, and that feeling that you belong there, and that this constant interaction of the human activity and the space in which you are, and the problems that we as architects have to find these spaces. I think my time is kind of running out for that part, otherwise I think it's the most fascinating thing, not that I have a solution to it, but is the importance to look at it, because I've came perhaps out of a generation where I was told that certain things couldn't be done. And I was delighted when we started to look that there was another dimension to architecture, an emotional dimension that had meaning again in the same way. And if you go back to some of the great buildings, and of course the point, this has nothing to do with style, what I'm talking about, that you literally, if you go into great architecture, and despite if it was Balthazar Neumann or Corbusier, that in their great buildings they understood to fulfill these elements and bring them to a total fruition, even if maybe at a certain time they were not fully aware why they did it, or they were perhaps misguided in thinking that certain things could be done by resolving it in another way. But intuitively, in my mind, great architecture has resolved these things, and I think in our struggle to build a better environment, it is very important to look at it. I now think probably I would like to disprove everything I have said until now, and just show some of the things we have attempted to do. And I don't know, what do we do now? We start. There's something. Can we go to number 1 here? I'm sorry. Let's try to get that back as he.
The two afterwards should be the ones that.
Yeah, no. Is that number one? Good. Well, then I was wrong. This is a building I did some 15 years ago, Eaton Center in Toronto. I'm told that some of you have seen it. And it was a very challenging task at the time because the developer wanted to build a huge shopping center inside a town, and I felt that there was something wrong with it, and that a shopping center in a city had to become part of the city. And in my arguments with them, felt that the example, the historic precedent for these buildings were the great passages of the 19th century that amazingly disappeared with the event of the automobile and then developed into the outside shopping center that was an enclosed revisit actually of the city in a certain sense. But what we tried to do there was to rebuild actually a street in the middle of Toronto and give it the feeling of a street. And in fact, it is 24 hours open, and people use it, and it fits within the grid line of the city itself. The event here was also to not only activate the inside, but also to activate the edges of the development and respond to the space in which they were. Yonge Street is a North American strip street, and we didn't want to create an institutional massive store there that would oppress the street, but we wanted to create, and we did, some 30 individual stores that all open out towards the street and in their height and form respond to the other side as it develops. The center, of course, relies very much on 3 subway stations that feed it. And of the something like 1 million visitors that are there weekly, approximately 60% enter it from the subway. And one of the attempts was really to make that an exciting and orienting exit, so that when you come like a mole from the underground, that somehow a daylight is shown to you, and also the direction. So the picture to the right is, for example, as you leave the Queen Street subway station, you come from the lower part into the space, and you're oriented back into the city street system. And then this is here the exit from the north side. And again, we had an endless battle because that particular plaza was owned by 3 different authorities: the Eaton Center, which actually is the Cadillac Fairview company, the Eaton store itself, which is a different entity, and the TTC, which is a transit commission, and they all were fighting and wouldn't go together until we ultimately convinced them that this plaza that is on the north side of the street is rather unused in the winter, and we could enclose it so that, again, when you came out of the subway, you came into an interior space, and a portion of the plaza that was hit by sunlight is outside space and then used in the winter time, in the summertime. Then the other part, that people should feel free to use it like you use a pleasant street rather than like a shopping mall. Actually, it was quite amusing. When we opened the building, I was accused that we had built something for the rich and we had pushed the poor away. And then a few years later, I was accused that we had built, where there was rather rundown district, that all the rubby-dubs would be coming there, and it wasn't a good, safe center anymore. And when one of the television companies interviewed me, we sat on a bench, and there was a lady sitting on one edge of the bench and a bum on the other end. And I said to him, isn't that wonderful that there is a city in which both sides of the city can sit down and be in the same space and enjoy it. And I think really that is an important thing to me, that cities are for people. Somebody somehow had said that the boulevards of Paris are the living room of the poor, and we have to build spaces in which people can be, not just a selected few. And the other thing is that the building itself, as the left side, can form the ornament in the uses. I mean, upstairs are the balconies, for example. It's difficult to explain to it, but the street drops something like 18 feet. And what I tried to attempt was that every time you were on the street level, there were trees there, and you had the feeling on the inside as well, how you related to the topography on the outside, and that the upper areas had balconies where people could sit and look down. That then also became kind of a complex addition to the park. And then the last side of this building, a totally different side again, facing, let's say, the formal City Hall square and a very important old monument, the old City Hall Tower. We wanted to create a feeling of a building that would not interfere with the wonderful architecture of this Richardson. Actually, it's a chap named Lennox, but he used Richardson as his example, kind of Romanesque building, and also to create there an entrance that was commensurate with the expectation of office users that did not want to get mixed up in the confusing shopping, yet you can reach it through the side entrance from this lobby. And then here, again, the feeling of the street and the attempt to relate again the space back to, there seems to be an unwritten formula of streets that is around about a 60-foot width and an equal height. And while that mall is something like 130 feet high, we tried in the upper part to give you this feeling that you relate to the 60 feet. And again, we brought that space up. To the right is a parking garage, actually, and to the left part of an office building, to create this inner space as a major gathering place for the city. And it has, in fact, become one of the major tourist attractions in Canada, to the worry, really, of the developer, because there are now, he feels, nearly too many tourists there. This is another project. It's called Queen's Quay, and it was the first attempt to recapture the life on the harbor. And there was a strong movement afoot to tear this building down, and we attempted to convince the authorities it shouldn't be torn down, and finally convinced them to hold a competition between developers and architects to see or to prove that it could be economically viable to reconstitute the building. We entered with a firm called Olympia in New York, and to the left was what the building looked like. You notice that the tower was chopped off at the bottom, and it had the railroad entrances. And what we tried to do was not to make the building better, but to kind of recapture what its architect perhaps would like to have done if he hadn't had to build an industrial building, in which his Art Deco decoration only went halfway, and rebuilt the front entrance. That is the bottom of the tower again here, and tried to build the additional buildings. For example, we had to set 300,000 square feet of residential buildings on top of it to treat them like a roof that reflected the old roofscape of the railroad station, which you barely see in this photograph, at the top of the Royal York Hotel. Actually, it's amazing. That building has over 1 million square feet in it, and is as big as the Toronto Dominion Bank Centre. It's a big black building that sits behind there in its volume, actually bigger. And also tried to bring a certain rhythm into the building by the addition of the bay windows, and then at the bottom, the greenhouses that you see, in fact, are partially stores and partially all the fire escapes that we had to build to exit the building in itself. But one of the biggest problems we had was an argument with the city planning that insisted that we would build an arcade all the way along the side to the outside because that would be nice for the summer life. As you see, the life in the summer is very active, but when it's 40 below and the wind is sweeping over Lake Ontario, no soul wants to be outside. And then there's a winter scene here that there's an inside mall. And what we tried to do was a building that really has two life cycles, the winter cycle and the summer cycle, and that in each cycle you have equal activities that attract people and make it enjoyable to be in here. And the stores really have overhead doors that then open in summer to the outside and the inside and allow for both to take place. And the key then was how to pull some building that is nearly 500 feet long, people to the other end from the city, and we created a large atrium space that on one hand allowed us to give light into the office spaces above, but also to make it a focus for retail to move down, and then left and played with the old structure, the old mushroom structure. It was built in 1825, and in fact by a New York architect, and was one of the first flat slab constructions really used in North America, one of the buildings really that inspired Frank Lloyd Wright. And then the housing on top that is also gives, in this case, waterfall and gardens, and below that area is a dance theater, the picture to your left, that then again activates the retail area in the evening when patrons that go for theater performances also eat. That was another competition we won, Baltimore Harbor. The approximately 1 million square feet of building, and let's say the first attempt really to bring serious shopping back in the downtown. The Thompson's waterfront pavilions were basically festival shopping, and the Rouse Company felt it was time that major shopping, other than, let's say, just tourist shopping, could come back into the city, and it was kind of a rather daring step that has been successful. The building has something like 1,200 cars below ocean level, and then the shopping area on 4 levels, a hotel, 600 rooms, and then a 500,000 square feet office building on top of it. It was a competition, and actually most of our competitors resolved it on the Eaton principle, but we felt that that was a wrong approach to this problem because people only entered it really from one spot. And so we used the Spanish Steps as the precedent of a multi-level shopping event that starts really from one spot, and actually even today still works with the church kind of as a visual conclusion. Not too many people go there. And we had a hotel as a visual conclusion in our resolution. And then here is that one entrance that is at the edge of the harbor opening into that event. And if you step into it, the picture to the right shows this event of a continuous series of escalators that move people up into all levels. It was a fairly dangerous experiment we did because usually in North America, shopping centers on more than 2 levels have problems to survive, but people seem to enjoy that singular movement up, and only the escalators turn around when they go to the hotel in the other direction. That's a view from the upper level back down into that level and some of the detailing as you move up into the space. And actually, I did that after I was forced in Queen's Quay, if you remember, to leave these columns in, which actually gave a wonderful space definition. And I changed my design and I put all the columns back in again in the grid as they had to be, rather than taking them out and make large transfer trucks. Saved a lot of money for the client, but also gave great spatial order to the space, because architecture is a very relative event. We somehow lost the slide. The right side is still Baltimore, the view into the far end. This here is, to the left side, a model, and to the right, a fairly poor photograph I took myself of the space. We just opened it in downtown Montreal. And again, the problem we had here was to tie into the underground system of Montreal. That is, I personally feel, rather depressing. And what we wanted to do is to tear it open and bring light to it. And on the other hand, is also integrate the street into the event. So you see below the underground system coming into on 2 levels, and on the second level where the light comes in, it is kind of Eaton Center cut in half, opening to the street on the outside. The building still is under construction, and that is a model shot of it. That the center is cut in half. The glass area you see at the back allows ultimately a great esplanade or boulevard in the sense of the Champs-Élysées perhaps. And by moving our building back, we opened the view. What you see at the back is the Mont Royal view that had been blocked previously and is now visible again from Place Ville de Marie. It's kind of a major urban axis, and hopefully this summer when we're finished, it will look something like the model to the left. Some of the detailing in which we respected the height and the construction of some of the historic buildings that are on the other side of the street. And here, again, to the left is the movement out of the underground passage coming from Ville de Marie into the light-filled space, and the fun of just being there as a major meeting place. And we tried to somehow capture the spirit of a French Montreal, which is quite different from Toronto. And despite some of the critics who felt they didn't want to see a Torontonian in Montreal, the Montreal I have taken with a great gusto to it, and the space is filled and people enjoy to use it and be in it. We built a huge fountain in there as kind of the meeting place and the signal that you have arrived. We actually, that's the fountain here from above and from below. We did a similar thing at Eaton Center, which after 15 years still attracts people with its play And I think people enjoy these elements that play with simple things and denote a certain space. I just want to quickly run through some of the hospital work that I have done, because this was the first one I did. McMaster, I'm not familiar if you, or I don't know if you are familiar with it, but it was the first interstitial hospital built in the world. And it was a concept I ran into with two deans of the school at this, Dr. Evans and Dr. Mustard, who kind of came to me and said, look, we don't know if what we're doing is right. All we know is that in a few years probably it will change, and it seems to be a horror that we build buildings that cannot adjust to these changes quickly. And I was at the same time building a hospital or putting a 200-bed addition to a 200-bed hospital. And in calculations we did, it would have not cost any more to tear the whole thing down and build a 400-bed new hospital than to put the 200-bed addition to the hospital. The reason for that is that all things are interrelated in a hospital, and if you start to change one thing, you have to change the next thing. And so therefore, if you transform a 200 into a 400-bed hospital, literally you tear everything down. And the idea was to build a hospital that was obsolescence-proof and where you could make changes without changing the hospital. The building is now 20 years old and has proven itself more than once. We, in the meantime, have done a number of them, and I think particularly in the United States, there are a number of interstitial buildings that have been done. And that is one of our latest ones that we opened, University of Alberta Health Sciences Center, again, where we tried to build a building. It was immense. It was nearly 2 million square feet in size. And fit it into an old campus that had kind of neo-Gothic forms and replay them and somehow fill in, but also not only deal with the problem of interstitial space and flexibility, but also deal with the human element within it. I worked for a fairly long time in Edmonton, and literally I would go, Edmonton is fairly far north, and in the winter you have literally only a few hours of daylight, and so you would go in the morning in the darkness into a hospital, you would be confined to its corridors, and at night go out again. And I felt it would be a marvelous thing if the three wings could be covered and be green space in which it was enjoyable to be. And actually there has been research done now on the hospital, and actually there are other researches for other hospitals there, that there's a very definite influence, and patients in this hospital that were moved from the old hospital to the new hospital. We first only moved 400 patients and 600 over, and the pharmacologist phoned us one day and said after 2 months, the patients in the new wing were using 30% less analgesic drugs than in the old wing. And so when then the second move came, there was a scientific study done to see if that could be verified. Another thing we tried to do is to take a 1,000-bed hospital and bring it down into small hospitals of 60 beds, each with its own entrance. These bridges lead into them with balconies where people can be and where you can relate back to a personal feeling, even to the point that we built individual kitchens for each 60-bed hospital, so that, because we found food is one of the biggest complaints in a hospital, and we felt that, you know, you could then say, Mary, that was a lousy stew, can't you do any better? Rather than saying, you know, I am number 276, and to kitchen staff number 370, the food was lousy and you got nothing. This is a new hospital just under construction in Toronto, the Sick Children's Hospital. And again, what we tried to do is to build here, and I don't want the details, a building that related to the child and gave a feeling of joy and also in this case allowed parents to live with their child and yet allow children again to live together. Too long at this moment to explain how we resolved it. I was jumping to a totally different thing. A hotel we did in Quebec in a marvelous area, and we felt it was a shame to jam a 20-story high-rise building there, and so we tried to create a village feeling there, and despite the fact that it's perhaps the most advanced technological conference center with conferences that can be held there with instantaneous connection to London, Paris, etc. It's used for that purpose. Another event, friend one day came wandering in and said he had collected 30,000 linear feet of logs from old log houses, and could I build him a house? And the attempt to build a log house, but with a certain rule in which you put log houses together. The tower at the left is an old wood silo, which is the entrance and also the sunspot, and then recreate the Canadian bush that really, and the landscape architect I worked with it, transformed again. Unfortunately, the area had been denuded with a septic tank bed and a grass lawn. We brought back the feeling of the Canadian bush as it was when the first settlers came in. And another house that is actually in the middle of Toronto, it was an old house built in 1917 that I remodeled and tried to pull back into the hill so that it became part of this ravine rather than kind of an intrusion that it originally had been, and the integration of various elements within this ravine setting, and the way in which a building lives through the various seasons. To integrate a building within a very heroic landscape that in particular Canadian history with the group of seven, I don't know if you're familiar with it, a group of painters that painted this area somehow responds to this feeling, but also had to be built really by laymen and with prefabricated pieces that we did and then brought by boat up onto the site. And then here, another project I got, I did some, it's now the 20th season of it, a job to build an exhibition pavilion for the Canadian government. Somehow I felt it was appropriate for Ontario to build into the lake as an image rather than building in the exhibition grounds which lie behind there, and to recreate a waterfront for Toronto because as you see, that was a condition before we started to build. There was a highway running along and literally eradicating any usable shoreline, and what we wanted to do is to bring an area back, and now we have more visitors there than Niagara Falls, and try to say that you can build urban parks on a fairly limited point. And the idea of the exhibition buildings to put them over the water was just, I mean, basically these are warehouse sheds to have changing exhibition within it. But we tried to use, like most good exhibition buildings, to try to use technology to the very edge of its being. And everything in this building, and I don't know if there's a closer picture of it, is under tension, so that the trusses are under tension, the walls are, as you see, with cables are hung, and even the beams below there are supported because steel has its greatest strengths under tension. And it was an event. But then also to have this contrast between the isolation of nature, and that is all man-made edges. As you saw in the picture, there was nothing there before. But the need for them was because the foundations, without these water breaks that we could build out of land masses and cost us maybe $1 million 20 years ago, a little bit more now, the foundations where we saved something like $9 million on the foundations, which otherwise would have been built much stronger. That is the IMEX, the first one that we developed with the IMEX people. An amusing thing, you see the people waiting. We made an event out of the waiting. And as we pulled the waiting away, the attendance in the theater dropped, so they brought them back again. And this constant play between different environments, the boat harbor, various parts of the park, and so on, were an event, to the little villages, the 3 different villages, the boat harbor village, and so on, to make it a place in which you could move and where you constantly had visual delight and visual change to enjoy it. That was the Ontario Pavilion at Expo. And again, what we tried to do there was to show the technological ability that Ontario industry had in a tension roof that actually was so complicated you couldn't put up a nut without using a computer with it, because it was great fun. Each part, thousands of parts that then created that huge umbrella that covered the exhibition space within it. And the roof of the lower part then became a theater event with Niagara Falls, you see, coming down over the stage and forming at the same time the air conditioning system. Unfortunately, like all exhibition buildings, that doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down. But the convention center here, that you see on the large pier, was a structure that is still there. And I think I'm pleased about that, because it seems to be a shame to have these exhibitions and then tear everything down. One of the problems we had was to maintain the views of Vancouver through the gaps of the street, so that the high building that you see had to be in a certain spot, and you see it here, leaving the views up from the streets into the harbor open. It contains around about a 300,000 square feet convention center, a shopping center, an IMEX theater, a hotel, 600 rooms, and some 500,000 square feet of office building, 2,000 car parking, and a full operational embarkation facility for the harbor of Vancouver. That ship you see in the model is a 500 feet long ocean liner, just to give you an idea of the size of the project. And then we play with the detailing that on one hand are highly functional and technically correct, but on the other hand are very strongly emotionally charged with the form of the building, and also setting a building that not only looked right within its backdrop of the city, but also within the backdrop of the Yard Harbor, and achieving a street, an esplanade for the city, where the city can walk out and again see the harbor and the magnificent mountains across the way, which previously was not possible within the downtown of Harbor. Just again, the size of it, that ship is a destroyer. But what I wanted to get again was a joy of people, the embarkation of people. And previously, I went there and it was like going to a concentration camp. People were driven behind a chain link fence into a shed, from there transported onto the boats, and nobody watched. Now the whole city can stand there and see a ship coming in, waving at them, and the whole joy of traveling that once was part of our life that has gone out, we hope to bring back. And here is a view inside the walkway into the convention center, the hotel in the middle, and the roof at the top. And then here, the view down from the upper hotel. And actually, we made the lobby kind of a street with a view onto the mountains behind there. And then the whole composition really a symbol for Vancouver as you enter, coming in from the Pacific Ocean into the city, as kind of the first thing that greets you, and where you, as a ship, then will put down and disembark. Just quickly, a project we're doing in Palm Beach now, an opera house, and again, trying to capture the spirit of that space and a building that not only fulfills the needs of an opera house, but also becomes a signal for its place. A large attempt, I think I haven't the time to talk about the lobby, as the theater for people, where people can see, and the importance, in my mind, to have that lobby focused in itself, so that you participate in one of the events. And then the theater, again, that becomes kind of an electric space that embraces the stage. And we went back to the historic Horseshoe Theater, which we feel is, let's say, the only theater space that really has worked, and many of our modern attempts to overcome them kind of lost their effect in the building. And a building that somehow embraces kind of the European tradition of the opera house, but also the North American form of the silo that has been part of that event. I just flip quickly through them. That's a project we're doing with Helmut Jahn together. He did the first phase. We are doing the second phase in Philadelphia. I just want to put that out as showing the importance, for example, of details, the rotunda inside there, and the way in which we wanted to create a space and the detailing for it that would give it a sense of importance, and also the response here to the street, in which we try to keep the street alive in a similar way as we did it at Eaton's, but in a different way, because the street in Philadelphia, Chestnut Street, is not kind of a strip street in the sense, but quite a cultured street with wonderful detailing. This is a competition we won in Cologne for the left shows you the location. It's just across from the dome at the edge of part of the old railroad area that has been taken away, and as most of the cities where these large railroad sheds are not required anymore, and some 40 acres developed for Media Park, which is a high technology part of the city, and we're at the moment in construction under it. One of the things, and I was very heavily attacked in the German press because I had discussed that the plaza that we were built had the proportions of Siena. And they were very upset that I had the audacity to introduce a totally foreign cultural event into Siena, into Cologne, and how did I dare? And in my defense to the city, I said, you know, how did Cologne dare to build its farm on an old Roman camp, because underlying Rome, Cologne is a Roman city, and furthermore then copy a French church, because the dome is built on the basis of French Gothic. And that it is kind of very short-sighted to find the, or to reject precedents that seemingly come from other cultures. There's a total cross-fertilization in architecture throughout the world, and that in fact our design fitted much better in the pattern, and I showed them the plan to the right and defy you to find where our project sits within the plan. The other plans had worked, like Ungers and so on, had worked very much on a rectilinear basis, and the jury, or some of the jury, felt that that should be continued. But in fact, many of the forms that sit within our plan were taken out of forms that are presently in existence in Cologne itself. Oops, I'm sorry. We're doing at the moment the major construction to build it, but a series of architects will build individual buildings. We will build some of them, and these were kind of, let's say, catalog pictures of the various facades, and as they will fit together and as individual people will build them. And perhaps it is not a dictatorship in the sense, but there is a very long tradition, really, of great places. If you look at the Place des Vosges or Place Vendôme or many of the German cities, that in fact architects followed very pre-described rules in order to get some urban sense to a particular space. A project we're doing at the moment in Toronto, and I just thought to throw that on, some of the complex shapes of it, let's say without a computer, would have been impossible to do the technical details for it. And as the last one, a project we just opened in Vancouver, a shopping street stretching across the street and connecting Pacific Center to a new development, and again trying to create an urban space that is before the opening here, still under construction, a space that is enjoyable for people to use and become a major space within the fabric of the city. Thank you. Sorry to be that long.
We, in studio, often tell you it's not your goal in life to determine what the limits are and then to operate within them, but to determine what ought to be done and then find ways to stretch the limits. And I think this gentleman has tonight shown you how you can stretch the limits. Are there any questions? I realize there wasn't much substance, so there may not be any questions.
Well, I think I've never built a decent building without a decent client. But I think you spend, as an architect, I would say 80% of your time trying to battle certain issues through than you know, the initial design. And one of I think the science of good architecture, what always amazes me is how it finally gets built, because it's so easy deflected and lost, you know, in practicality and all kinds of other things that interfere with it.
Well, this gentleman has to get up and leave tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock to catch a plane, so thank you very much for your attention.